Let's talk about one of the most incredible rescue missions in history. It's a story about how 2 million people were saved from starvation, not with weapons, but with candy, coal, and a sky just full of airplanes. Let's dive in.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll see how a city got split right down the middle. Then, we'll look at the trap that was set, the absolutely unbelievable plan to get out of it, the desperate race against time, and finally, how this one event really did change the world.
All right, so after World War II, the winners, that's the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, carved Germany up into 4 zones. But here's the catch. Berlin, the capital city, was also split 4 ways, even though it was deep inside the Soviet-controlled part of the country. As you can imagine, this created a really tricky situation.
Now, all of this was happening right at the start of something called the Cold War. And now, it wasn't a war with actual battles and armies fighting. It was more like a super tense standoff, a rivalry, between the Western countries and the Soviet Union. And the city of Berlin, it was ground zero.
The real heart of the problem was that both sides wanted completely different things. The West, the US, Britain, and France, wanted to rebuild Germany and make it a strong democratic ally. But the Soviets, they wanted to keep Germany weak, basically a buffer zone, so it could never become a threat again. These 2 goals were on a collision course.
And that collision, it finally happened because of something you might not expect: money. A simple decision about a new currency was about to trigger a massive crisis.
So, to try and get Germany's economy back on its feet, the Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark. The thing is, they did it without the Soviets' approval. The Soviets saw this as a direct threat, a move to make the western part of Berlin powerful and prosperous, which would undermine their control. So they decided it was time to act.
This brings up a really interesting strategic question, right? How could the Soviets wrestle control of Berlin away from the Allies without actually starting World War III? Their solution was shockingly simple.
They just sealed it off. Remember, West Berlin was like an island inside the Soviet zone, so they just shut everything down. Every road, blocked. Every railway, halted. Every canal used for shipping, blocked. And then, for good measure, they flipped the switch and cut off the city's electricity.
Just try to imagine that. 2 million people overnight completely trapped. No more food coming in, no more fuel for heat, nothing. The Soviets figured the city would be forced to surrender in just a few weeks. But the West wasn't about to give up. They came up with a bold, maybe even a crazy plan. It was called Operation Vittles. The idea was simple but sounded impossible: supply the entire city by air.
The scale of this operation is just mind-boggling. To keep a city of 2 million people alive, planes had to be landing around the clock. At its peak, a plane was touching down in Berlin every 45 seconds. It was a perfectly choreographed, non-stop dance in the sky.
Now, you'd think food would be the #1 priority, and it was vital, for sure. But look at this. The biggest challenge by far was coal. They flew in almost twice as much coal as food. Why? Because that heavy fuel was absolutely essential for generating electricity and, more importantly, for heating homes through the brutal German winter.
Flying in all these supplies was already incredibly difficult, but doing it during a harsh German winter, that's when this mission went from dangerous to downright heroic.
I mean, these pilots were flying in near-zero visibility, dealing with dangerous ice building up on their wings, and trying to land on frozen runways. And the ground crews? They worked in freezing temperatures, 24/7, to unload those planes as fast as humanly possible. It was just a relentless, dangerous effort, day and night.
And in the middle of all this, a really small act of kindness became a huge symbol of hope. An American pilot named Gail Halverson noticed children always gathered to watch the planes land. So he started tying candy to tiny, makeshift parachutes and dropping them as he came in to land. He became famous as the Candy Bomber, and his gesture reminded the people of Berlin that the world hadn't forgotten them.
So the city refused to give up. The pilots kept on flying. And as that long winter finally turned into spring, it became obvious to everyone. The Soviet plan had totally and completely failed.
The whole thing lasted for nearly a year. The Soviets had bet everything on the Allies quitting during the tough winter months, but they were wrong. In fact, the airlift just got more and more efficient, and by May of 1949, the Soviets had no choice but to admit defeat and end the blockade.
And get this, the airlift wasn't just a success, it was a staggering logistical triumph. It became so efficient that by the end, the planes were delivering more supplies each day than the trains and trucks had before the blockade even started. The Soviet strategy was a complete and utter failure.
So the end of the blockade wasn't just the end of a crisis. It was a massive turning point, one that would shape global politics for the next 40 years.
So what were the long-term effects? Well, first, the airlift helped turn a former enemy, Germany, into a close friend, leading to the creation of a democratic West Germany. It also directly led to the formation of NATO, a military alliance designed to protect Western nations. And maybe most importantly, it showed the world that air power could be used for peace, becoming this powerful, lasting symbol of freedom.
The final numbers are just incredible to look at. More than 277,000 flights, over 2.3 million tons of supplies. The planes flew nearly 100 million miles in total. That's basically the distance from the Earth to the Sun. It was one of the single biggest humanitarian efforts in all of history.
But that victory came at a real human cost. It's so important to remember the 101 Allied pilots and personnel who lost their lives flying this dangerous mission. They were remembered as true heroes who died in the service of peace.
The Berlin airlift is such a powerful reminder that the biggest victories can sometimes be won without ever firing a shot. It really leaves us with a question to think about. In a world so often focused on conflict, what else could we achieve if we used our greatest inventions to help each other?